Last couple of hours, there's been confirmation that President Zelensky of Ukraine will soon be travelling to the United States. He is intending to attend the United Nations General Assembly session. He's going to have a meeting in Washington with President Biden, and he's also looking to meet senior members of Congress from the Democrat and Republican parties. He's undoubtedly coming, apparently, with something of a begging bowl. He's going to ask for more weapons and more support from the United States. This, of course, shortly after the visit to Kiev of Secretary of State Blinken and the various comments from US officials and, of course, from Blinken himself, which I have discussed extensively in recent programs, which all but confirm that the United States is now telling President Zelensky that US support for Ukraine has gone as far realistically as it can. It is time for him and for the Ukrainian leadership to start looking for a diplomatic way out of this conflict, preferably by freezing the conflict along the existing battle lines, a message which, for President Zelensky, is deeply unwelcome. And interestingly enough, we've just received news that on the eve of his visit, the Americans have dealt President Zelensky with a further snub. It seems when Secretary of State Blinken came to Kiev, one of the topics that the Ukrainians brought up was the perennial topic of the ATACMS missiles, these 300-kilometer supersonic missiles, ground-launched. Many people have been advocating, lobbying for them relentlessly to be supplied to Ukraine. It's been suggested that these might be a game-changer weapon. There's been lots and lots of articles and commentaries explaining why that is not so. There was another long article to that effect, I believe, in Foreign Policy, explaining that there are no game-changing weapons that can solve the problems for Ukraine. And I would add that if you want a complete deconstruction of the fallacy that the ATACMS are going to make any decisive difference in the war, then the best place to go is a recent program. In fact, I believe it is the most recent program made by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas. But putting all that aside, apparently the Ukrainians, President Zelensky himself, whilst Secretary of State Blinken was in Kiev, pressed Blinken to announce or to confirm that the United States was finally going to supply these ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. And the purpose of this, the purpose of all of these demands, all these requests from the Ukrainians is perfectly clear, putting aside what, if anything, these missiles can actually do for the Ukrainians, an announcement that they are going to be supplied by the United States to Ukraine at a time of flagging morale in Ukraine itself. We'll come to that in a moment. Well, such an announcement would be a sign of continued support from the United States. Well, Blinken said nothing about ATACMS missiles deliveries to Ukraine whilst he was in Kiev. And we're now getting reports that the United States government has decided that it will not announce the supply of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine whilst President Zelensky is in the United States. Now, to my mind, this is all the makings of a diplomatic snub, or if not exactly a snub, perhaps a decision to put President Zelensky in his place, in the sense that I think that the United States has quietly made a decision to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. one would have thought that it would be the obvious thing to do to announce it whilst President Zelensky is in the United States. It would be something, a show of support, something that he could take back with him to Kiev, to be able to tell people that the Americans are behind him. And of course, it would also be a signal to the world, and indeed to the American people, that American support for Zelensky and for Ukraine continues to be unfaltering. But someone in Washington has apparently decided that announcing this decision at this time, whilst Zelensky is in Washington or in New York for the General Assembly session in the United States, would muddy the message, which is the message that the United States is trying to convey to him, that military supplies, military support are now coming to an end. Ukraine needs to sit down and think about what it can do with a view to bringing the war to some kind of diplomatic conclusion. So Zelensky is going to come to the United States. He's going to meet Biden. He's going to meet the Congress people. He's going to speak to the United Nations General Assembly, where it's become increasingly obvious to me that he doesn't have that many friends. He wasn't invited, for example, to the G20 summit meeting in Delhi because the Indians didn't want him there. Prime Minister Modi of India had a very difficult and unhappy meeting with Zelensky in Tokyo during the G7 summit. And President Lula of Brazil was incensed when he did agree to meet Zelensky at the G7 summit in Tokyo, but Zelensky failed to turn up. Anyway, in both cases, it seems that the Indians and the Brazilians, and of course the Chinese and the Russians, didn't want Zelensky in Delhi and for the G20 summit, and the Indian hosts made sure that he wasn't given an invitation. And of course, they can't bar him from the United Nations. He will come, he will speak at the General Assembly, but it's clear that all diplomatic efforts to win over what perhaps might be better described as the global majority, but which most people still refer to as the Global South. Anyway, it's now increasingly clear that all attempts to win over the Global South or the global majority to the cause of Ukraine have failed, and I noticed that recently there's been an increasing number of articles appearing in the US media about that. So, President Zelensky will be coming to Washington. He'll have all of these meetings. He'll be going to the General Assembly in New York. But the word at the moment is that he will not get ATACMS missiles whilst he's in the United States, despite all the statements, all the reports that the United States has all but decided that it is going to supply them. Now, I have to add quickly here a word of caution. This is, of course, what is being said at the moment. Decisions of this nature can always be reversed if the US officials decide that the meetings with Zelensky have gone better than expected, or alternatively, if there is a shift in the kaleidoscope of power in Washington, something which can happen at any time, given how complicated things politically there always are there. Well, if something like that happens, then of course an announcement that the ATACMS missiles will be supplied might nonetheless come while Zelensky is there, and he will have his diplomatic win. But for the moment, all the reports are agreed that this isn't going to happen, and that in itself is already a significant snub. Now, Zelensky is, of course, coming to Washington, a deflated and, in some ways, a diminished man. Last year, when he came to Washington before, when he addressed the two houses of Congress, when he waved the Ukrainian flag at the Congress people, when the great majority of people in Congress, though not all of them, stood up and gave him a standing ovation. Well, when he came last year, he was the hero of the hour. The Ukrainians had recently won a successful battle in Kharkiv region. It turned out that they paid a very heavy price for that battle, but nonetheless, they'd recovered large areas of Kharkiv region. They'd recovered Izium and Balakleya and Kupiansk. And of course, he'd also had what appeared to be a successful victory in Kherson region. Ukrainian troops had pushed all the way to the Dnieper River and had regained control of Kherson city. Again, things were not quite as straightforward as that in reality. The Russians took a strategic decision to withdraw from Kherson region on the West Bank. Most people today who follow these things from a military point of view conclude that that was the right decision. Again, the Ukrainians suffered horrendous losses over the course of the Kherson offensive. But nonetheless, Ukraine, last year, at the time of Zelensky's trip to Washington, was visibly gaining ground. Morale was high. The media around the world, at least in the West, in the Western world, were applauding him, and it did seem as if he was surfing towards some kind of victory. There were some rather strange comparisons, comparing him to Winston Churchill, for example, a comparison which I have to say I found strange at the time, and which I think looks even stranger with hindsight. But anyway, that was then. Now the situation is very different because, of course, last year, even as the fighting in Bakhmut was escalating to some kind of critical point, as we know, even as he told Congress last year that Bakhmut would hold, the reality was that the situation in Bakhmut was deteriorating, and Zelensky's words about Bakhmut holding proved to be false when Bakhmut fell fully under Russian control in May. But anyway, if one looked away from the crisis in Bakhmut, all the talk at that time was of Ukraine going back on the offensive. And there was a meeting in Ramstein, and all the Western governments agreed that they would provide Ukraine with the heavy armor, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, the armored personnel carriers, more artillery, more shells, all those things for this next Ukrainian offensive which would come, which would be the biggest, which would strike the decisive blow, which would win Ukraine its victory. And there were, and it must be said, cautionary notes. There were people who were saying that the fortifications that the Russians were creating were very powerful, that it would be very challenging for Ukraine to break through these fortifications. There were some attempts on the eve of the offensive to play down its prospects, but nonetheless, the decision was made to press forward with it. And the expectation, no doubt, was that by the time of the General Assembly session, in a few weeks' time, later this month, when President Zelensky came to New York and then to Washington, well, he would be coming as the victor. Except it hasn't turned out that way. The offensive has run out of steam. It's failed to achieve any breakthroughs. It's not breached the Surovikin line. It's not captured any important population centre. It's not captured Tokmak or Melitopol, much less Mariupol. It's not reached the Sea of Azov. It's not even managed to capture Bakhmut or any of the villages around Bakhmut. More about that at the moment. And Ukraine is suffering simply appalling losses in the meantime. So he comes this time as a deflated and diminished figure. His forces have not achieved the breakthrough that everybody expected. His demands on the United States, on the Western powers, seem endless, and the perception is growing in the United States, well, perhaps not that they have a debacle on the immediate horizon. That perhaps is something that American officials can't yet accept or internalize, but it does look increasingly like another unwinnable forever war. And of course, people like Samuel Charab of the Council for Foreign Relations, well, he's been saying that for several months now. He said that in that Rand Corporation report, which appeared in January, and he's been saying it since. And I think this view, very grudgingly, very reluctantly, is beginning to gain increasing amount of traction amongst US policymakers. So, President Zelensky, this time, is not coming as the hero of the hour. He will still get a polite reception. He will still be told that the United States is fully behind Ukraine. We'll probably hear the mantra of as long as it takes repeated once more. But President Zelensky himself has told us in that interview in The Economist, which he gave short time ago and which I've discussed in an earlier program, that when people tell him this, that they're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, he looks into their eyes and he now realizes that they're no longer telling him the truth. And that, I suspect, is what he's going to encounter in Washington. Meanwhile, his offensive grinds on, and the Russian Defense Ministry has provided one of its most interesting summaries for a very long time. What makes this particular summary interesting is that instead of talking about what's been going on in the last day, the last 24 hours, it's looked at the overall fighting in the period from the 9th of September to the 16th of September. In other words, over a period of 1 week. So it gives us, unusually, an overview of what is going on. And it talks about the fact that the Russian military have launched missile strikes and have shot down 2 MiG-29 fighter jets and 3 Sukhoi-25 ground attack aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force. But it's what it says about the situation on the battlefronts over the last week that is most interesting. And it says this: in Donetsk's direction, the enemy, that is to say Ukraine, did not abandon plans to capture Artyomovsk, which is to say Bakhmut, and continued to conduct assault operations by groups of the 28th, 93rd, 28th, 93rd Mechanized, 80th Air Assault, and 3rd Assault Brigades, unsuccessfully trying to dislodge Russian troops from Klishayevka and Andreevka. These are these two villages to the south of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. Now, yesterday, there were reports that the Ukrainians had managed to capture Andreevka, and they were all over the British media. And I have to say that after those reports appeared, a Russian journalist went to the area and he did an on-the-spot report, and it's clear that Ukraine does not control Andreevka. This village is all but destroyed. Most of it appears to be in the grey zone. Neither side controls it. It's another one of those villages which is contested and which Ukraine has failed to consolidate control of despite intense battles. Now, there's been an awful lot said over the last few weeks about Andreevka. I said that a couple of weeks ago, I gained the impression that Ukraine had previously captured it, so I was surprised that fighting was still going on there when it started to be reported over the last 2 days. It turned out that, in fact, the Russians were defending Andreevka from Ukrainian attacks, which rather showed that the previous reports that the Ukrainians had captured it were untrue. Then we got reports about 3 days ago that the Ukrainians had captured Andreevka, then that turned out to be wrong. And then yesterday there were reports that the Ukrainians had again captured Andreevka all over again. And as I said, we had the further reports later in the afternoon from a Russian journalist that Andreevka is, if not under Russian control, it is in the grey zone, and the Ukrainians do not control it. So, battle for Andreevka, a village which, I am told, before the war, had a population of 75 people. 75 people. We are talking about a very small place indeed. Hardly a village, more like a homestead than a village. But there it is, apparently all of this intense fighting, and the Ukrainians have still not captured it, this tiny place, formerly of 75 people. And, well, this is what the Russians claim happened over the course of those attempts that the Ukrainians made over the last week to capture Klashevka and Andreevka. Over the past week, in this direction, Russian forces repelled 34 attacks launched by Ukrainian units, as a result of which the Ukrainian military lost more than 1,700 servicemen killed and wounded, 16 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, 34 motor vehicles, and 12 field artillery pieces. 1,700 men, according to the Russians, killed or wounded on the part of Ukraine in terms of the fighting here. Now, I would say straight away that, as we will see, this continues to be the area where Ukraine, according to the Russians, suffers the heaviest losses. It suggests that despite all the attention given to the southern front lines, it is the area around Bakhmut which continues to be the epicenter of the war. It is there where the fighting is most intense, where more people are dying than are dying or getting wounded in any other part of the battlefront. 1,700 servicemen killed and wounded, according to the Russians, and we are going to see shortly that there is now indirect confirmation from the United States that these losses, these personnel losses that the Russians are attributing to the Ukrainians, may have a strong element of truth behind them. Anyway, the Russians also have to say more about what has happened in other parts of the battlefields over the last week. And if we go back to the area of Rabotino and Verbovoye, about which we have heard So much, we read, that Russian troops repelled 18 attacks launched by the Ukrainian armed forces close to Rabotino and Verbovoye. As a result of significant manpower losses, the Ukrainian command was forced to begin withdrawing the 82nd Air Assault Brigade to the rear in order to recover combat capability. Now, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade is the elite brigade the Ukrainians threw into the battle in this part of the battlefront. It is the one with the Challenger tanks and with the Striker infantry fighting vehicles, and it forms the centerpiece of the so-called Maroon Tactical Group. It's part of the 10th Corps, which is supposed to be the corps that would exploit the breakthrough that the Ukrainians were anticipated to achieve against the Surovikin line, the fortifications that the Russians have built in this area. When it became clear that the first exploitation troops were not going to break through, the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 9th Army Corps, the 10th Corps was committed to the battle at the end of July, but the Maroon Tactical Group with the 82nd Air Assault Brigade at its core was held back in reserve. Then it became clear that that force, the other elements of the 10th Corps that launched that attack in July, that they weren't going to break through either. So instead, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade and the Maroon Tactical Group were thrown into the battle at the end of August, and they did push the Russians back to some extent in the village of Rabotino, though, as I've said in many programs since, the village itself continues to be contested. Well, the Russians now say that this most important of Ukraine's remaining brigades, remaining as of mid-August, this most important reserve unit has now suffered so much damage, has experienced so many losses, that it has had to be withdrawn from the battlefronts, and it has had to be taken back to the rear, where it must be again re-equipped and reinforced with new men from mobilization, men who are unlikely to have Western training, and the experience of the troops who have been lost because, well, it's not managed the great breakthrough of the Surovikin line that some hoped, and its losses have been so extremely high. And then the Russians go on to say that the 71st Jaeger Brigade of the Ukrainian military from the Strategic Reserve, along with the combined assault groups of the 47th, 65th Mechanized and 46th Air Mobile Brigades of the Ukrainian military, are now involved in this operation to hold locations. Now, that suggests that the Ukrainians are now cobbling together units from disparate brigades. The 47th Mechanized Brigade was the original brigade which was supposed to break through the front lines back in June. We're told from German sources that it has suffered losses in four figures, perhaps had 4,000 men to start. So at least a quarter of these have been lost, at least. This is from German sources. There's lots of reports about the bad state of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and we see that the Ukrainians are perhaps amalgamating it, or what's left of it, with these other brigades. And the key words of these are now involved in this operation to hold locations. So this report from the Russian Defense Ministry rather suggests that the Ukrainians are no longer advancing in the Orekhov area. Their losses have been so high that they've been pushed onto the defensive. And just to also reiterate, the 71st Jaeger Brigade comes from Ukraine's strategic reserve. It's an elite unit, not apparently one of the Western trained units, or so I understand, but it was one of those last units that Ukraine had. It was from the strategic reserve, not supposed to be, as I understand it, part of this offensive, but it was there to provide the last line of defense in case things went wrong. It's had to be committed to this offensive, a fact which shows how badly beaten up the various brigades that had been earmarked for the offensive have become. And then the Russian Defense Ministry says the Ukrainians suffered losses of about 740 Ukrainian personnel. They mean obviously killed and wounded, 20 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, and 20 motor vehicles throughout the battle. 38 enemy field artillery guns were eliminated as part of counter-battery warfare. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about this in a moment, but note again, 740 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded. That's around 40% of the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed and wounded in the fighting around Bakhmut. That again highlights the intensity of the fighting in Bakhmut, that is more intense and more costly in terms of lives than the fighting that's taking place on the southern front lines. But notice again that the armoured vehicle losses here continue to be very high. 20 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, 20 motor vehicles, 38 enemy field artillery guns. And the Russians, contrary to what many people think, have been devoting a huge amount of time to counter-battery work, and they seem to be taking a very heavy toll of Ukrainian artillery pieces. I've noticed that almost every day now, for several days, they've been claiming destruction, for example, of M777 howitzers. So the number of those is diminishing quite fast. But anyway, counter-battery work is clearly intense, and Ukraine again is suffering numerous losses of artillery pieces. I'm confident that these losses that the Russians are reporting in terms of artillery pieces are correct. And of course, as several people, Brian Beletic again, Simplicius the Thinker also, have pointed out, in terms of artillery, the Russians started with a very significant advantage, and despite claims that the Ukrainians are more successful in counter-battery work than the Russians, the reality is that it is the Ukrainians who seem to be suffering, not perhaps necessarily the bigger losses, but at any rate the more significant ones, because they have less artillery to work with. Now, the Russians say that the Russians also go on to discuss the fact that there were also attacks on the Vremivka salient area, and here I get the sense that the fighting has remained at a pretty intense level, and the Russians say that there have been surrenders of Marines from the 36th and 38th Brigade in the Vremivka salient area. They say that Russian troops repelled 8 enemy attacks over the last week. And here they say that the losses, Ukrainian losses, were 1,100 servicemen killed and wounded, Ukrainian servicemen killed and wounded, 15 armoured vehicles, 22 motor vehicles, and 7 field artillery pieces. So yet again, though artillery and armour is being more methodically destroyed, extensively destroyed by the Russians. In the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, on the Vremivka salient, in the Vremivka salient, Ukrainian losses again are extremely high, higher than they are or have been over the last week in the Rabotino Verbovoye area, though less high than in the Bakhmut area. So, very heavy losses by Ukraine over the last week. And the Russians also add that the Ukrainians suffered more losses in the Kupiansk area. They lost around 400 troops in and around the Kupiansk area. They say that further south, around Liman and in the Serebyansky forest, where a lot of fighting has been taking place. In that area, the Ukrainians lost around 400 men, dead and wounded. And the Russians also say that the Ukrainians have continued to try to make raids across the Dnieper into the Russian-controlled area of Kherson region on the east bank, and have also tried to capture islands in the Dnieper. And they say that, again, they imply that these attempts have been largely unsuccessful, and they say that in this area, Ukraine has suffered losses of 360 men killed and wounded. This over the course of the last week. So, by my estimate, we're probably looking at somewhere around 5,000 men killed and wounded, according to the Russians, over the last week. But note again that the Russians say that in the key axis, the one that the Americans and the British have singled out as the most important axis of advance, the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, Ukrainian losses have been so high, both in men and equipment, that the most effective unit left, which was committed to the battle in August, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, has had to be pulled out for reconstitution, and that the Ukrainians currently are on the defensive. They are no longer attempting to advance in this area. At least that is the implication for me of what the Russian forces, what the Russian Defense Ministry are saying. Now, I said that we've had some indirect confirmation of Ukrainian losses from an American source, and it is just about as indirect as it comes. But the US Army War College has released a brief overview, as it says, of lessons from the war in Ukraine. It says that military doctors project that if the United States were to find itself in a conflict similar to the one in which Ukraine is in, then the United States would be looking at losses of 3,000 600 men killed and wounded a day. Now, it's important to stress that the Russian figures, which look higher, they only include killed and seriously wounded. I suspect that this figure of 3,600 a day simply relates to just killed and wounded in every form. And then the War College, the US Army War College, says that the combat replenishment rate needs to be 25% or 800 troops per day. It points out that in 20 years of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US lost about 50,000 troops, whereas in a conflict like the one, in a conflict on the Ukrainian level, the United States would suffer losses on that kind of scale. We're talking about dead and wounded within a period of around 2 weeks. And the War College has pointed out that there are insufficient reserves in the US military to cover losses on that scale. US military reserves in 1973 numbered 700,000. They were 450,000 in 1994. They now stand at just 76,000. They come nowhere close to the number that's needed in order to sustain the kind of war that the United States might find itself in the event that it was to have to engage a peer adversary like Russia or China in the kind of way that Ukraine is doing. Now, you can scramble these figures, you can look at these figures in all sorts of ways. It's not quite clear to me that the loss rates are exactly analogous. But when the United States is talking in this way, when the USA's own War College is talking in this way, well, that, it seems to me, does indirectly confirm the scale of Ukrainian losses. Now, when Ukrainian losses are as high as we're reading, when the Ukrainians are losing around 5,000 men a week over the course of what I suspect has been a relatively quiet period in the offensive, well, that rate of loss is unsustainable. And as I've discussed in previous programs, information from MediaZona, the NGO that studies Russian loss figures by breaking down, by hunting out obituary notices and such things and funerals that take place in Russia. Anyway, it's calculating that the rate of loss that the Russian military is suffering is falling, and falling fast, even as the rate of loss that Ukraine is suffering is increasing. Now, we come back now to this issue of possible negotiations between the Russians and Ukraine. And President Putin has made certain scathing comments about this over the course of a press conference that he had with President Lukashenko of Belarus. President Lukashenko is currently in Russia. He's actually met with Putin in Sochi. They're meeting there at the moment, and they had a press conference after a meeting, and Putin had the opportunity to respond to certain questions that were put to him by journalists, and they were all extremely interesting. But firstly, the first point was he was asked to comment about the United States supplying cluster munitions, and he was asked about the extent to which cluster munitions are now being used in Ukraine, and Putin said that they are indeed being used by Ukraine on the battlefronts, and he said it's a completely typical situation that the United States, seeing itself as the exceptional country, is happy to supply to Ukraine weapons which it condemns unequivocally when some other side uses it. But look at what he said in response to the comments from Blinken. The ones that Blinken made in his recent interview to ABC, which I discussed, where Blinken said that the Russians should make the first move. They should speak to the Ukrainians, if they speak to the Ukrainians about peace negotiations, then the United States expects that the Ukrainians will agree to negotiate, and then at that point the United States will support the Ukrainians in the negotiations. And of course Blinken used the metaphor that in negotiations it takes two to tango, so two sides need to be in negotiations. Now, it's, I think, unwise to make jocular comments like that, metaphors like that, when dealing with someone like Putin, because Putin almost invariably seizes on the metaphor and plays it around and jokes with it in his own way, and that's exactly what happened. But anyway, let's go first of all to the Kremlin's readout of this entire exchange about negotiations. And this is the question that Putin was put to Putin. A broader discussion has arisen, again at the Eastern Economic Forum, over the possibility of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, and Blinken's statement that it takes two to tango about Russia and Ukraine. How do you assess the prospects for talks? Now, that was put to Putin by a Russian journalist in light of Blinken's comments. And this is what Putin said. As for the Americans, they do not even know how to tango. They have a tendency to, for all the wonderful, amazing music and beautiful movements, the United States is trying to approach everything from a position of force through economic sanctions or financial restrictions or threats to use military force and actually using it. They are lecturing others even though they have no idea how to do it and do not want to. Most likely they just do not want to. This is the first point. Second, I already said that we have never refused to hold talks, so please, if the other party wants them, they should say so directly. I'm speaking about it, but the other side keeps silent. Finally, tango is good, of course. I think Ukraine should not forget about its Golpak dance. That's a Cossack dance, a Ukrainian Cossack dance. It is important, otherwise they will keep dancing to someone else's tune. And by the way, everyone will have to perform the Barinia dance, or in the best case scenario, the Kazachok. Now, I think the last dances that happen maybe in funerals. I'm not sure. Perhaps people can advise me about this. But look, let's unpack what Putin is saying. First of all, he's ridiculing this talk about two to tango in terms of negotiations. He says that whenever the Americans talk about negotiations, they always do so in a very threatening and bullying manner. They threaten people with sanctions and military force behind all the nice words. There's always the mailed fist from the United States, and they always lecture others. But then he goes on to say that in reality, they have no idea how to do it and do not want it. Do not want to. Most likely, they just do not want to. This is the first point. So the Americans may be talking about negotiations, but they've no real idea how to negotiate. Whatever proposals they're putting forward, Russia is not interested in them. And ultimately, deep down, the Americans not only don't really understand how to conduct negotiations, but they don't even really want to negotiate. Their heart isn't in negotiations. And secondly, he says, well, look, we in Russia, we've never said at any point, at any time in the conflict, that we're not willing to sit down and talk. But if you want to talk to us, then let's have nothing more, no more of these elliptical signals, these hand signals, these signals conveyed to us through these ex-diplomats rocking up in Moscow, engaging in Tier 1.5 talks, all these interesting articles that appear in the news media in places like Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, all these elliptical words that Blinken is coming up with in his interviews with ABC and in his recent speech at Johns Hopkins University. Putin says, just talk to us straightforwardly. If you want to talk, say so directly. That's what he says. And he says, he always talks about it. He always says, we're prepared to sit down and talk, but the other side keeps silent. They're not really in earnest about this. And when they talk about negotiations, they can't bring themselves to do in a straightforward, honest, and frank way. And that already calls into question the extent to which Russia can rely on all of these hand signals. As far as the Russians are concerned, all of this suggests that the Americans are not really in earnest and are not talking in good faith. And then Putin goes on to say, as for the tango, well, Ukraine should not forget its own dances, because currently what it's doing is it's dancing to the American tune. The Americans control Ukraine. When Blinken is telling Ukraine to start negotiations, to respond positively to Russian negotiation, to any Russian proposal for negotiations, that's an order. That's something that the US is telling Ukraine to do. Ukraine has lost its sovereignty, and if the Ukrainians don't realize that, well, soon it will end badly for them. The Gopak, as I understand it, is a cheerful dance. Perhaps the other dances less so. Anyway, Lukashenko was also at this press conference, and he also had his own things to say. And this is what he said directly after Putin made those very interesting things. He said they sort of started dancing, that's to say the Ukrainians, and held 3 rounds of talks in Belarus, then in Istanbul. And then Blinken and Austin told Zelensky, and then Putin interrupts, gave a command, and that was it. And then Lukashenko says, gave a command, and he prohibited them to talks. The facts are on the table, they are obvious, so they should not blame anyone. And Putin went on to say he signed, that's to say Zelensky, signed a decree prohibiting talks, and Lukashenko went on to say exactly they forbade themselves. So there we are. The whole business, negotiations. It's really not on the Russians' agenda. The Russians are given a meaningful proposal for talks. They've made it always clear that they're prepared to sit down and discuss it. That's not to say, by the way, that they will necessarily agree to it. But they're prepared to talk. But the initiative has to come from the other side, and it has to be clear, and it has to be meaningful. Putin and the Russians are not interested in all these complicated soundings and maneuvers that the Americans are engaging in. Now, I think we can treat this as definitive. I suspect that the Americans, as is always the case, will not accept this. I suspect that over the next few weeks, after the offensive, the current Ukrainian offensive runs its course, there will be more attempts by the Americans to try to persuade the Russians to initiate the talks and to sit down with Ukraine. But it's absolutely clear as crystal to me from these comments that Putin is making that the Russians are not interested. They're not prepared to hold discussions with the United States in the kind of way that the Americans want them to. And I don't think anything is going to happen that will make them change their view about this. Anyway, Putin also had some things to say about Kim Jong-un's visit. And there was a really very bizarre question which asked whether it was true that Russia is seeking volunteers from North Korea to fight in Ukraine, and Putin emphatically denied it and said that this is all complete nonsense. And then he went on to talk about relations with North Korea, and he said that yes, the Russians will work hard to develop relations with North Korea. He said Korea is our neighbor and we must build good neighborly relations with our neighbors one way or another. There are certain specifics associated with the Korean Peninsula. We discussed this openly. We never violate anything. And in this case, we are not going to violate anything. But of course, we will look for opportunities to develop Russian-North Korean relations. I have to say, frankly, that I found this a very odd exchange. As far as I am aware, no one, at least in no place that I have seen, has there been any suggestion recently of North Korean volunteers coming to fight for the Russians in the special military operation. There were some such claims about a year ago, but the North Koreans themselves emphatically denied them, and the Russians did as well, and I've not heard of them revived at any point since. What, of course, we have heard a great deal of is about Russia buying 152mm shells from North Korea. Now, Putin could have been asked about that, but wasn't. He was instead asked this very bizarre question about volunteers instead. I can't help but think that this was a carefully structured exchange made up in that kind of a way in order to avoid discussing the issue of shells. In other words, not to mention shells at all. And that does beg many questions, and I'm not sure that I can answer them entirely. But note how careful Putin is to say that the Russians will not violate anything. They're not going to breach anything. he is in effect saying that the Russians do not intend to violate UN sanctions. Now, you can take that as you will, but as I understand it, UN sanctions would prohibit Russia from importing shells from North Korea. I'm not absolutely certain about this, but certainly the Americans and the South Koreans claim that, though I've never seen it confirmed in any one single place. But anyway, Putin went out of his way to say that Russia is not going to violate sanctions. Now, it could be that the reason this question was set out in this fashion is that Putin takes the view that importing Russia buying shells from North Korea does not violate UN sanctions. He wants to make it clear that the Russians are not going to violate UN sanctions, but he might also not want to disclose the fact publicly that the Russians are buying shells from North Korea. It may be that he takes, and the Russians take, a different view about sanctions, the sanctions that the United Nations has imposed on North Korea. Or it could be that Putin doesn't want to get drawn into a discussion about shells. He doesn't want to be asked or to give any hint about the scale of Russian shell production. There's been much talk and discussion about this. As I said in a recent program, as Brian Beletic has discussed more recently, according to the New York Times, US officials now estimate Russian shell production at 2 million rounds a year. Now, that would, by the way, be double the amount of shells that the United States hopes to be producing, according to the latest claim, by 2025. And of course, it is far more than the United States is producing now. At the moment, the United States is only producing a fraction of that amount, 2 million shells a year. But I have it on very good authority that the Russians are actually producing much more. I touched on this yesterday. I received a very detailed report based on careful studies of plants, of factories, of supplies of raw materials, of labour force. It seems to me that on the basis of this information, that Russian shell production is substantially greater than the 2 million that the Americans say. It's more likely to be somewhere around 3 to 3.5 million. And it will probably increase further over the course of this year. Now, the same person who was discussing shell production has also provided me today with a lot of information about tank production, which I am not going to discuss in detail. Not in this program. In a future program, definitely, but not in this program. But one thing that did stand out to me, and which I found very interesting, is that he made a point which many others have made previously, that the limiting factor in terms of weapons production by Russia at this time is not facilities. The factories are there, the machine tools are there, the raw materials are there as well. This includes materials for tanks and shells and other things. It also includes microchips, pretty much the entire range of microchips, other than the most advanced microchips, which, as we now see with the Huawei phone, the Russians can, in fact, import from China. So, it includes all of these things. This person has also, by the way, pointed out that even in areas where the Russians were previously behind, they've now drawn level. Over the last year or so, they've hugely increased production, for example, of night vision devices, and he provides a lot of the data about that, the hard data about that, not these general assumptions based on the supposed cost for the Russians of producing these things. But again, to reiterate, this person says the limiting factor is not machines or factory space or resources. It is trained manpower. The Russians have probably, in fact definitely, more trained manpower for this purpose than the Americans do, but a lot of the men are now joining the army, and Putin said that the number of people who've signed up is around 300,000. So lots of men are joining the army. Unemployment rate in Russia is now, well, so low that one can almost talk about no unemployment at all, to all intents and purposes. So there's a shortage of people. And I did wonder whether perhaps, given that North Korea does have a large trained workforce, the real intention is not to import shells from North Korea, it is to import labor from North Korea, to get North Korean workers to come to factories like Uralvagonzavod and other places where they will be heavily supervised by the Russians and will, of course, be able to engage in production there. Or alternatively, if not workers not for Uralvagonzavod or in the factories making shells, in other factories. And Kim Jong-un has been on a fascinating tour of the Far East, a most interesting tour. He's visited an airbase, a Russian airbase. His host was his old friend, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. He was shown a Kinzhal hypersonic missile. He was even able to touch it. He was shown the production line for Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 57 fighter jets. The Sukhoi 57 is, of course, Russia's fifth generation stealth fighter. It is shortly going to receive a new engine. One of these aircraft is now flying with that engine. So he was shown all of that. He's been to ship repair facilities. He's visited a warship. He's seen missile productions, missiles that have been produced on this particular warship. He's visited lots of things. He's also been shown a new model Tupolev 214 aircraft. This is a civilian aircraft which will be coming into service in large quantities for the Russian airlines. In Russian airlines, it's a derivative of an aircraft developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but extensively modernized. And it's also, by the way, likely to be serving extensively in the Russian Air Force as well. And I wonder whether the idea is ultimately bring in North Korean workers, get them to work in these factories, on the production lines, under Russian supervision. The assumption is that these workers will gradually, through the mere act of working in these factories, acquire a great deal of technical knowledge and expertise, so that when they're able to return to Korea, they will have that expertise with them, and they will be able to put that to use in developing North Korea's own industries, in which the Russians might, of course, also place orders. This is possible. It is speculation. Of course, North Korean workers working in Russian factories would not speak Russian, so there would have to be all kinds of people to help with that. But we've seen how in other countries which have attracted workers, guest workers, that has not always been a problem. That has not generally been a problem. It seems to me that this is possible, and it might also be a way of developing military industries, Russian military industries, using a North Korean input which doesn't breach the sanctions. Certainly, I found Putin's response a strange one. And it seems to me that the very fact that Kim Jong-un is visiting all of these military facilities, is looking at fighter jets and Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and all of those things, and is visiting a Russian warship and is being hosted by Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. All of that does clearly point to a burgeoning military relationship between North Korea and Russia as well. Anyway, we'll see. There will no doubt be more revelations coming soon. But anyway, the big takeaway from today is that Ukraine's offensive is, as I said, stuck. It seems that, at least in the Robotino-Verbovoye area, the Ukrainians are perhaps temporarily on the defensive. It looks as if President Zelensky is going to get a cold reception in Washington and has already been snubbed by the Americans even before he goes there. And it looks as if the Russians have ruled out negotiations in the most scathing and mocking terms. If we look at Putin's comments, they were, as I said, utterly mocking, and that some kind of relationship between Russia and North Korea continues to develop. Much going on. We don't have all the answers. And of course, we still don't know whether the Russians are going to launch an offensive of their own in the next few weeks. I'm confident that they will, by the way. I think there's far too many indications that that is indeed what they're planning. We've had people like Lukashenko and Alaudinov and Belitsky all talk about it. I would be extremely surprised if after all these signals it didn't happen. But anyway, one way or the other, we're just going to have to wait and see what is going to go on. But the one thing I can say with confidence is that negotiations will not take place at any time soon. The Ukrainians don't want it. The Americans might, but very much on their own terms, which are unacceptable to the Russians. And the Russians think that this is a ridiculous idea altogether. Well, that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon. In the meantime, let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, above all, Locals and Rumble. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our work. You can also support our work by going to our shop, getting all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.